To get us started, I'm going to start out with some, I think, relatively well-known facts among this group. Not always when you talk to other groups, but we all know that women have lower income and wealth than men. We hear the number 73 cents on the dollar for income. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the gender wealth gap is pretty huge as well, and of course that's related. If you look at people aged 59 to 60 in the HRS, women have about 83% of the wealth of men. And if you have been primarily single over your life, 38%. If you were black, 30%. So those numbers are quite substantial. Women also, somewhat related, have lower Social Security benefits than men. They also tend to live longer, which means they need money for a longer period of time, and they tend to end life single. So really when we think about what the old age poverty problem is, it's really a women's problem, it's not everybody. Women who reach that age of 65, which is not looking as old as it used to, are much more likely to be in poverty than men. 1 in 10 women age 65 and over are in poverty. If we look at black women, it's 1 in 5. And if we look at single women, it's something around that as well. So this is a huge issue. So the big question is why. And I've been interested in women in investing for a very long time. In fact, my first paper I ever presented on this topic was at the Pension Research Council in 1995-ish, something like that. But what happened for me that made me interested was something else. In the mid-90s, my employer switched to from a public pension that was pretty generous to a 401A that was also relatively generous in the amount they contributed, but we don't have Social Security there, so that's not as generous. But one of my colleagues, Alex Bernasek, who I've also written papers with, if anybody knows my work, they've probably seen it with her name. She didn't know what to do, and a representative from one of the investment companies we were using said, "You're a woman, you'll probably want to invest in bonds." Now, collective gasp from this audience, hopefully. And actually, my colleague had enough sense to know she should collectively gasp as well. And she came to me and she says, "Vicki, is this true?" And I said, "No, not really." But we started looking at why do people say that kind of thing, and is it true? And that was a paper we published in the 90s also, which was just a think piece. Why do people invest differently? Why do women invest differently? That's actually still my most cited paper, even though it's not an empirical paper. Then I did a paper with Jack Vanderhei where we looked at DC plan investments and found, yes, indeed, women in those plans invested more conservatively than men. We also looked with another colleague at SCF data in the 90s, and yes, indeed, women did invest more conservatively than men, although that was sort of self-reported investment allocation. And this led me to a slew of papers on different topics related to why women invest differently than men. So Olivia came to me last year, this is like the other guy said, and said, "Would you like to write a paper on how women's different investing affects retirement planning?" Or I said, "Sure, no problem." Well, it turns out in that time frame, this last 30 years, there have been so many papers on this topic, all different angles on it. And many people start out with the premise that women do invest differently than men, and I will admit I was thinking that's where I was going to be going. But as I started looking at it, I'm finding that maybe women have learned a little better. And I know from some of my own work that the changeover from younger women are investing a little less conservatively and more equivalently to men. So this paper then turned into one on what are some of the other reasons why we still see some differences. And that includes research on papers on all different topics. So if anyone looks at my paper, you will probably collectively gasp at the length of the reference list. And that's because there's just so many papers that I wanted to include. So in my original paper, that was the think piece, I had a nice little chart. And what I started with, as I pulled all the papers together, I said, I've got to organize this in some way. And my original co-author, Alex, was interested in discrimination. She was a feminist economist. So that was where she started from. I don't think that's the issue anymore. So I put it on this table, but I think everybody gets pretty equivalent advice, and all that stuff is pretty similar. I originally came at it from a finance professor's point of view. It's all about, and an insurance PhD, thought it's all about risk preferences, and that has to be different. And there's a bunch of literature on that. But in more recent years, there have been some new topics that have come up that seem very interesting. Of course, financial literacy, we all know that one. But also personality types, and I have a couple of papers that deal with that. And self-efficacy has turned out to be a very strong predictor of what people do. Genetics, when we were talking about conscientiousness earlier, I have done a paper where we looked at genetic markers for conscientiousness and neuroticism and other personality types and found some linkages. But I think what happens in all of this is when you control for everything else, the gender differences go away. So that's my in case I don't get to the end, that's really my conclusion. I have a problem with some of the data that we use, and there's so many papers, and everybody uses a lot of different sources, but every one of them has a problem with looking at gender issues. Large national surveys like the HRS, SCF, the Understanding America study measure risk aversion often by hypotheticals. I've done some experimental work where we did some actual measurement in other ways too, but I still think people don't always know how to assess their own preferences. And so the hypotheticals and self-assessment aren't that great. So it might be better to look at what they actually do, but our national data sets don't have a breakdown of everything that they do. So we might have a detailed information about IRAs, not as detailed about DC plans, not as detailed about some of their outside investing that they do, or their real estate. And we have real estate asset, I should say, we do have that. The other thing is that national survey data is at the household level. How do we allocate assets among the members of a household? So my own research, when I've looked at that, I've split out single men and single women, but I'm not really one who believes that people who are single are representative of the population necessarily, even though the number of singles is much higher now than it was 20 years ago. Retirement plans have good asset data, but they don't have as much information about everything else that's relevant. For example, in my own case, if someone looked at my asset allocation in my DC plan, they would say, well, she's moderately conservative. Well, they're not counting the fact that I have a whole lot of investment real estate that they can't see. And that's all risky, so I take that into account in my own allocation. Now, I'm going to skip over some of the details here. The paper has a lot of the research papers, but risk preference studies where they're doing experiments or looking at what they say about their risk aversion usually conclude that women are more risk averse. They answer questions more risk averse. Some of that might be because women don't like to answer questions they're not certain about. We know that in the financial literacy data, they sometimes say don't know more commonly. So that's another thing that women do differently. But there was a very interesting paper recently, not that recent, 2015, by a statistician who looked at a bunch of risk preference studies and looked at them in more detail on the stats side and thought that maybe this was more likely confirmation bias. They come in thinking they're going to be more risk averse, so they torture the data a little bit to make sure that they use the right measure that shows that's true. But a lot of emphasis on small differences that probably aren't enough to really account for what we see in practice. And I mentioned the financial literacy and financial self-efficacy. Those things are very different for men and women, and if you look at those, they often are good predictors of actual investing in wealth. Now, plan data, as I said, we know have a lot more details, and these are also based on really large numbers of people. So we look at Fidelity or TIAA or Vanguard or any T. Rowe Price. There's a lot of them have done studies of what their participants do. They know if they're men or women. They don't know necessarily everything about their household. But what they are finding is that the differences between men and women have gotten much smaller over time. And my I think, really interesting graph in one of the recent studies, this I think was Jack Vanderhei, in their public plan data, showed that when women have chosen to allocate some of their money to target date funds, that the difference between men and women essentially goes away because the target date funds already have an allocation to equity, and that makes the allocation by women almost the same as the allocation by men. There's still some really small differences. If they don't have target date fund allocations, they're still better than they used to be. And as they get older, it kind of converges a little. So I think that's very promising. And as we look at younger women today, we probably won't be asking this question at least for the people who have plans. But there is still a large percentage of the population who are not in retirement plans. So then the question is, what are the other possible causes of retirement wealth differences? And I love my little elephant in the room picture, but it's really about personal choices. And the elephant in the room, I believe, is penalties to motherhood and occupational segregation. All of those things leading to lower career trajectories for women. And if you have less money to invest, you're going to invest less, and you will have less in the end. So that's kind of like a tautology, right? But women spend a lot fewer years in the workforce, and they get penalized both in their employer plans and in Social Security, which gives them zeros for those years that they were not in. Occupational segregation, a lot of people don't realize this, but the top 5 occupations for women are still the ones our mothers had as top 5 occupations. Teacher, nurse, retail, I'm missing one of the other big ones, social worker. They're all ones that are fairly low paid. And why are they doing that? It's because they have flexible hours, because they can have a family. My original training was to be a lawyer, and I quit my legal profession because I wasn't conducive to having a family. Where did I go? Education, because I could have summer time with my kids. So my career trajectory from a money perspective was much lower going to education, even though an academic one is better than high school. Or I think that would be better to be teaching college students than high school students anyway. There are also some differences we see in some of the new literature that has to do with genetic and hormonal linkages to investment risk-taking. There were some earlier studies that showed that higher testosterone made you take more stock market risk. There are some very interesting studies coming out of new genetic information that's being included in some of our long-term longitudinal surveys. So, for example, the HRS has genetic markers for all the personality traits, also for longevity now, which is a very interesting one that I think there'll be some good research coming out of. There is one for risk aversion, although I will argue that's the way they come up with it is by using one of those self-assessed risk aversion measures and seeing which of your telomeres, help predict that. But my research in looking at genetics doesn't show super strong results for any kind of gender difference. But I mentioned the other ones earlier. So here's the ones I think we get the most traction out of and where there are some possible solutions that could be worked on at a policy level. We can't fix who we are, right? We are perhaps socialized into believing that we should be the mother figure if we have children. Gender roles are part of that socialization process. And my co-author, Alex Bernasek, she, of course, believed that all of it was due to us being not allowed to play sports and that kind of thing, right? But that stuff is relatively similar for men and women today. Girls play sports as much as men. Maybe we don't have the same, higher level sports teams to go on. It is also true that the lower earner is probably the one who will stay home with the kid because that just makes sense. But lower financial literacy is one that we can work on, and we know those are linked to household wealth, earnings, and career trajectory, and all of that thing. Divorce rates are a very interesting social problem. The 1/3 of divorces today are for women, for people over 50. So a woman who gets divorced over 50 is going to experience a pretty extreme reduction in standard of living. Now, men do too when they get divorced, but it's worse for women. So that affects they might tap into their 401k to help bridge the gap when they're trying to make it through those first few years. Fewer people are getting married, and we know that household economics works better when there's two people sharing costs. And today, compared to 20, 30 years ago, we have about almost 50% of the adult population not married compared to 30-something in the 1980s. So that's a really big difference. That doesn't mean they're not together in a household, but it does change the finances. And women have more student loan debt than men, quite a bit more because more women are going to college. So that's going to affect their ability to save as well. Now, I didn't include this in the paper, and I may or may not, depending on what people think, but there's very little done on the LGBTQ experience. So even we're talking about gender, it's not just about women, but it turns out it looks like they're very similar to women in the sense that they have some of the same problems. And the career path issues are the same. They have a lot of student loans, lower financial literacy. So this is one really good paper. I got this from a sample that had good data, but there's not a lot done there. That might be something to be done. So coming back to my original graph as kind of a wrap up, I think it's wrong to blame it all on people's differences in risk aversion. I don't think that's the issue. I think we have to work on the other things that lead women to have less money to be able to invest and perhaps be more careful about their investments. So the solutions, I think, have to rely on the labor market, which could include plan sponsors in their plan design, and on education. And the continued pressure on the gender pay gap, people will say, well, you put two people that are the same together, they have similar income. That's not really true either. It's true it reduces the gap if we only look at people in the same career. But women are still less inclined to negotiate their starting salary. We should work on that. They are less inclined to ask for raises than men. We should work on that. And that's an educational piece as well. But what can the employer do? I think reducing penalties, and this could be at the national level, reducing penalties for time out of work. And that's a little bit harder to do. One thing could be prorated benefits, so when you're working part-time. Family-friendly work policies that allow caregivers to stay in the workplace. Caregiver choices that are good quality caregiver on site is another choice, and some of the high-tech companies have done that. And additional tools. One last point, though, has to do with Social Security, that the fact that many women can't get 35 years in the workforce and they get zeros averaged in for their pay wasn't as big an issue when they were relying on their husband's income for their benefit. But with more single women, they will be relying more on their own earnings history, and I think that's going to be important. Notably, all those family-friendly things I mentioned, most of the other OECD countries already have all that. The U.S. is way behind in making sure that we make those changes for women in our current situation. So thank you very much.